I must admit, I've been an editor of the journal for a long time now, but I've never shared about my work or my experiences with an audience like today. So we'll see whether this is profitable for you. Let me first say that I admire the Ukrainian people and especially the Ukrainian theologians for continuing to do theology even at this difficult time, in the time of war. And I'm very glad that this seminar can go ahead and that you can go ahead with your work. And I hope that God will bless your work and your nation. Now, I'm sure that I was not invited to speak today because I would be a famous theologian. I'm not well known at all as a theologian. I'm just the editor of a journal. So what I bring is the perspective of somebody who receives articles, who then sometimes has to tell the author, sorry, this article cannot be published, and who sometimes has to do work to get the article ready to be published. So what I'm saying is not so much about how you do your research as well as how you get your research ready for publication. After you've done your work, how then do you present that in such a way that it can be published in a journal? And much of what I say probably also applies to how you would publish material in a book, only a book is longer, of course. Let me first make a distinction which is important in English, but I don't know how that works in Ukrainian. In English, you have two words, the word scholarly and the word scientific. And for the work of theologians, I see Alexander thinking how to translate that. Maybe it doesn't work like that in Ukrainian, maybe it's not a problem. In English, when you say scientific, you talk about what scientists do, and that's things like mathematics and physics. What theologians do is what you would call scholarly work. So that's a slight distinction, and it's not so important that you maintain it, but you may want to use the word scholarly in English and maybe the Ukrainian equivalent of that. So I've produced slides for this paper, and I'm now coming to my second slide, which is about the choice of your subject. And what I then need to say is that if you want to be published, it's important that you have something new to say. Being a scholar, being a published scholar, is not just repeating what the fathers have already said from of old. It's not just repeating what certain authorities have already discovered, but an article brings something new and something that adds to what we already knew, to the knowledge that already existed. So you've done your research, you've discovered something small or something big. It doesn't have to be big, but you have got a new angle on a subject, and you are going to tell the world about that. Sometimes, though, you don't have so much a new idea yourself, but you have gained perspective over a field of research. I'll take my example from the study of the book of Acts in the New Testament, and I do that because I'm a biblical scholar myself. So you could have a new idea on who wrote Acts, or on when Acts was written. You might have a new theory about the ending of the book of Acts. Why does the book of Acts end so suddenly? But an article could also be an overview over recent research, like what have Ukrainian scholars in, say, the last 100 years said about the book of Acts? Have they done justice to Acts, or have they ignored it? So you could provide an overview over research, over recent research or research that goes back a little bit longer. What do the commentaries in the last 25 years say about the authorship of Acts? And then you can try to come to a conclusion and add something of your own. So an article can sometimes be an overview of research and not so much your own new contribution. But different journals have different takes on that. And the higher up a journal is in the hierarchy, the more important the journal thinks it is, the less keen they will be on overviews, and the more they will want something that's really new, really spectacular. What you always need to do, what you need to try to do at least, if you want to publish something, is use modern literature, use contemporary literature. Thinking again about the book of Acts, John Calvin wrote a commentary on Acts, and people in the 18th and 19th century wrote commentaries on Acts, and they're all very interesting. But if you are going to write on Acts, you need to try to use the most recent literature. That's a kind of rule that's not necessarily a Christian rule, but that's just something that is important in scholarship. Use the most recent literature. And I think we can now say we are well into the 21st century, that the idea would be that you basically try to use commentaries published in the 21st century first and foremost, supplemented maybe by some older commentaries that are still authoritative. This, of course, is very difficult, and it gives a great advantage to, say, Americans and other people in rich countries who can afford to have all that recent literature in their libraries so that it's available for consultation. If you live in a country that's not so affluent, or if you live far away from a good library, it is pretty difficult to use the most recent books. And many of these books are just not affordable for individuals. A commentary on Acts can easily cost you $100 or £100, or whatever the equivalent might be in Ukrainian courage. But that just means that you have to try to get access to recent literature, some of which could be online. But again, online you often only find the older stuff. But you have to make the effort to use the more recent stuff whenever you can. That's the kind of norm, especially in Western journals. And yeah, it's a difficult one. It clearly disadvantages people in the majority world, in the Christians in the south of this world. But for scholarship, it's a kind of rule. This rule does not apply so much if you investigate things that are more historical, if you go into the history of something, because then almost by definition, older publications can still be relevant and useful. But if something more recent has been written about that kind of subject, you still need to try to use the more recent stuff. There are certain companies that put more recent material online if you pay for it. One facility that I got to know from Spurgeon's College is called Per Lego. And if your institution can have access to that, that enables you to consult recent literature without having to buy it, which is also, of course, environmentally friendly, because you don't get all these books on your shelf. You just consult material online. So this next slide then says that in an article, you need to try to limit yourself to just doing one thing. It's similar as to when you write a book or tell a story or present a sermon. the idea is that you try to make one point, bring one new element, discuss one topic. So, for example, again, when you write on the Book of Acts, you are either going to say something about the enigmatic end of Acts, or you're going to discuss the authorship of the book, or the date of the book, or something else. But try not to do more than one thing in an article. And likewise, try to follow one method. Now here, I can only give illustrations from methods in biblical studies. In other subject areas, the methods will be different, but the same will apply. You need to choose which method you're going to use. For example, in biblical studies, you could take a historical critical approach to the subject, or you could take a narrative approach to the Book of Acts, or you could take a more political view, a more political reading of Acts. What does Acts say about the Roman Empire, about the attitude of Christians towards the church, towards the state, etc., etc. Don't mix up your methods and try to be critical. So once you have done some research, once you think you have got some result, go back and ask yourself, what have I been doing? Have I just limited myself to one method, and have I been faithful in doing that? Better, of course, ask yourself that question before you set out, before you start doing the research, but then also always come back to that. And another thing is, keep your introduction short. Introductions just tell the reader what you're going to do, and they can be pretty concise. There's no need to give a long introduction. In fact, that's often wrong, because it takes away from what you're actually going to say. And introductions often contain stuff that is not very interesting for the readers. The best way to write your text, be it an article, be it a book, is that you write your main text first, the body of the text. Then you write your conclusion. And last of all, you write your introduction, which can then also be short. And the introduction is best written last, because it tells the reader what you are going to do. And you only know what you've actually been doing by the time you have completed the rest of the text. So you write the middle bit, the body, first, then you write your conclusion, and the introduction best comes last. You can always, of course, make notes already for what definitely needs to be in the introduction, but don't write the thing yet, because you couldn't be accurate, because you haven't done all the rest of your text yet. When it comes to using sources, one of the rules of modern scholarship is that you have to consult the original, if at all possible. Try to use the original source. An example again, if it's about a biblical scholar like F.F. Bruce, who wrote on the Book of Acts, then you need to quote Bruce himself. It will not do that you say, so-and-so says that Bruce says. That is, in fact, always wrong. You have to use the book by Bruce yourself. If you absolutely cannot get hold of the book by Bruce yourself, then you could say in a footnote, I'm sorry, the book by Bruce was not available to me, so I have to quote what somebody else quoted from him. But that's kind of second best. And yeah, that just shows that your library wasn't up to doing the research that you needed to do. Try to use your original sources, and that's important. Go back to the real people yourself, in the same way that when you study the Bible, you quote what the Bible itself says, and not what somebody else said about the Bible. When you quote, always be literal. I would think that you were already taught this in your theological school when you did your undergraduate training, but it's worth repeating. When you quote literally. If you don't want to quote the whole sentence or the whole paragraph, you can omit bits by putting in a few dots, 3 dots, but don't change the wording in any way. And also, wherever possible, try to quote the original language and then provide a translation. Or the other way around, put your translation in your text, but give the original in a footnote. So in the case of Bruce, and if you're writing in Ukrainian, what you could do is give the words of Bruce in Ukrainian in your main text and then the English in a footnote, or the other way around, the English in your main text and your Ukrainian translation in a footnote. But make sure that people can get as close as possible to the original text and quote it literally. And always acknowledge whatever debt you might have to somebody. So where you use somebody's work, whether you just get an ID from someone, provide a footnote to say that this ID originally comes from Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so. Don't pretend that something is your own unless it really is your own. Most people might not detect if you borrow IDs from somebody, but in fact, if you don't acknowledge it, it's a form of stealing, and that's not fair. As good Christian scholars, we should not be doing that. Moving on to my next slide, more about the use of sources. When you write an article, it sometimes helps to have a discussion with 1 or 2 scholars in particular, and to reflect on what they said about the subject and compare and contrast your own ideas with what these people have written. So again, when it comes to Acts, you could be in dialogue with this big modern commentary by Craig Keener. And you could say, Keener says this, but yeah, I think so-and-so. Or you could be in dialogue with F.F. Bruce and say, this is what Bruce says, and I agree with him here, and I disagree with him there. But they have to be real people who you see as equals, or even as your superiors. And I've used the English word straw man. Don't know whether that word is common in Ukrainian. Don't select somebody just to criticize them, but select somebody to be in dialogue with who are serious scholars and for whom you have respect, even though you may not agree with them. You never have to agree with anybody, not even with the highest authorities, not even with a great commentary writer like Craig Keener or F.F. Bruce. You can always disagree, but do so respectfully, and select as the people that you are in dialogue with, people that you have respect for and who have said really useful things. Otherwise, it becomes very easy if you just select somebody whose ideas are ridiculous, then your article isn't going to be very serious. It would just be pushing over straw men. When it comes to using sources, be careful with the use of the Bible, in the sense that the Bible in scholarship doesn't answer all questions. If issues come up about, for example, the end of the book of Acts or the literary structure of the book of Acts, you can't just quote a biblical text and then say that is the answer to this question. You will have to investigate the question, and you will have to listen to what biblical scholars have said about this. So or just sprinkling biblical texts around doesn't work in a scholarly article. That is what could work in a devotional article, where you show your knowledge of the actual text of the Bible, but it doesn't work when you engage in more serious biblical study, and especially, of course, not in other subject areas like Christian doctrine or church history. Biblical texts don't normally answer the kind of questions that come up there, so be careful that you don't use them too much and not in an appropriate way anyway. Moving on to the structure of the article, before or after writing, and often, to be honest, that will be after writing, make an outline of what you have been doing. Which points have you covered in your article, and how does your argument flow? So point 1 in my article was that I tried to say this, then I did this, then I took that step, and then I came to my conclusion. And if bits that you have written don't fit into that structure, they might either be in the wrong place, or they might not belong in your article at all. So do an outline, and often when you write down your research, the outline that you have in mind at the beginning will be different from what you end up with after you've done it all. So then do it again and be critical. Okay, this is my introduction. This is where I make my first point. This is where I make my second point, my third point, etc. You could have quite a number of points, but make sure that everything then fits logically. Throw out, put away everything that does not fit, and make sure that the steps that you take are logical, so that a reader who does not know you and who might not know too much about the subject matter can still follow what you have been doing, what steps you are taking, and how you get from where you start to where you end up to your conclusion. If you have something important to say that does not fit into that structure, you can use what we call an excursus, so a bit that stands a bit outside of the argument, a bit outside the structure, but that still contains some information that you think is really important to pass on. But an article should not contain more than one or maybe two excursus. Otherwise, it just becomes a big bag full of goodies. And that's not what an article is. An article is a sustained argument. Likewise, a book, you make an argument and you present that in a logical order. When it comes to actual writing, I'm not sure, of course, what conventions are in Ukraine, and conventions might be slightly different in Germany, say, from what they are here in the United Kingdom and in much of the rest of the West. But basically, try to keep your sentences reasonably simple. Germans would disagree with me, and you can in German articles see sentences that cover a whole paragraph sometimes, and they show that the author is really good at writing. But for readers, it's not so easy to follow. And I would say that when you write, you're not only showing that you are a clever person, but you're trying to reach your audience and to make your audience understand what you're doing. And then relatively simple sentences are more important, are better than complicated things that nobody can understand. And where even the editor has to think, does this sentence flow well, or does it not flow so well? When you use particular words, particular terms, technical terms, define them. Say explicitly what you mean by a certain word, and say that clearly in language that is understandable to others as well. So I, as a biblical scholar, I will try to write in such a way that also people who are more like systematic theologians or church historians or practical theologians can still understand what I'm trying to do. They may not understand everything, but clearly they should get the terms that I'm using.
For example, when you write about the book of Acts and you come to the miracles that happen in Acts, the healings that are performed and the resurrection of that person, then try to define what, according to you, is a miracle. And when you write about the type of book that Acts is, if you talk about history, historiography, try to be clear about what historiography is, etc. Those were the points that I put together for today. I'm now coming to the second part of this paper, and I see that I'm taking much time, so I'll try to go a bit faster. These are the questions that now follow, that I ask my peer reviewers when I send them an article. So let me first of all maybe explain these words. I don't know how they work in Ukrainian. A journal like the journal that I'm the editor of, the European Journal of Theology, when we receive an article, I take the name of the author out, and I make sure that other people can't see who the author is. I just make a note of that. And I send the article anonymously to 2 other scholars, and they're called peers. Peers are your equals. So what we do is blind peer review, in fact, double-blind peer review, because the reviewers don't know who the author is, and the author doesn't know who the peers are, who have judged the article. One interesting thing is that many of them talk about author and peer as he, whereas often, of course, it's a she, but that just betrays a kind of prejudice that some people have. But it does show that the double-blind peer review process works. The author doesn't know who the peers are, and the peers don't know who the author is. So they can judge the article kind of objectively. They might not even be able to guess which country the author is from, or whether they are in an academic position or not. So that's the peer review process. And I'm in between. I'm the only one who knows these things. And I give the following 6 questions to the peer reviewers to answer about any article that comes in. So the first question is, does the article take a broadly evangelical point of view? And that is because our European journal is an evangelical journal. There are, of course, many journals that don't have a specific point of view, are not specifically evangelical, and then that question would not be so relevant. But I could think that if you have, say, a reformed journal, you would want the articles to have a reformed point of view broadly, so that as an editor, you are not too unhappy with the opinions expressed, although you may not agree entirely with everything. The second question is about the suitability, and you may just want to read what I've written there. It's that articles should be useful to theologians all over Europe. That's because we are a European journal. In your case, if the journal is just for Ukraine, it should be useful for all Ukrainians. And they should interact with the relevant scholars, like in my case, European theologians. If people only refer to national heroes, national poets like Shakespeare here in England, other people might not understand that so much. For you in Ukraine and for people in Finland or Portugal, I'm sure Shakespeare is not particularly relevant. And do keep in mind that many readers will not have a working knowledge of Greek and Hebrew, is what I say to my peer reviewers. That might be different in Ukraine, but make sure that you know what your target audience is, who read your journal, and that you don't scare them away with too much Greek or too much Hebrew, which often is not really necessary and can be translated, so that the article is more accessible to many more people. The third question for my peer reviewers is the
relevance. Does the article say something new, original, or does it at least restate older ideas in a fresh and relevant way? That's something I have already discussed before, so I will not say too much about that again. Question 4 is about the, sorry, need to move my slide on. 4 is about the quality. Is the argument logical? Is it coherent? Are there gaps in it? Can any parts of the text be omitted without loss to the overall flow? And it happens regularly that my peer reviewers come back and say, yeah, the article is acceptable, you could publish it, but the author needs to take out certain bits which are not so relevant. Or there's something missing here. The author is taking a step too quick and they need to add some evidence for what they're saying here or there. So even in an article that in itself is acceptable, there could be points where your reviewers say, yeah, but, so it can be published, yes, but, and then you get some comments and the author gets the work back for further work. Coming to my last slide, my last couple of questions for reviewers. Is the article comprehensive? And again, I've already said something about that before. Have the major sources on the subject been considered in biblical studies? Has the author looked at important commentaries on Acts? Not necessarily all of them, but a good selection of important commentaries. Does the author interact with leading scholars of the past, sometimes of the present, or no, sorry, sometimes of the past, always of the present? Does the author know who the leading scholars are? And do they talk with them rather than with people who are really not so important? And you ask the peer reviewers to indicate omissions and to give specific guidance if possible. Peer reviewers are often specialists in the subject, and they can say, yeah, the article is okay, but this author also needs to read the book by Mrs. So-and-so because that's missing. And then the author is told, read Mrs. So-and-so and make your article more complete. And finally, then the question of fairness. Does the author represent the views of others in a fair and benevolent way? Do they avoid unnecessary polemic? Obviously, you will not agree with everything that previous people have written. In fact, it helps, of course, if you disagree with people, because then you have something new to say. But at the same time, these people are colleagues. They have done their work in good faith. So they are your friends. They're not your enemies. And you're going to say, I respect Dr. So-and-so very much, but I think on this particular issue, they're slightly wrong. Don't be negative about anybody. Don't be harsh about anybody. Just be assured, assume that they have also done their best and that they want to be treated fairly as you want to be treated fairly. So think how you would feel about the kind of criticism you have on somebody else. Try to be factual and not to criticize the person, even if you think that what the person is saying is actually quite incorrect. It's an opinion you're criticizing. You're not attacking an enemy, but you are in dialogue with a fellow scholar.